Good morning, ChatGPT.
Good morning. How's it going?
I'm fine. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. How about you?
I'm fine, thank you. I have a question for you.
Of course. What's your question?
People say that the Sabbath is for the Jews. Is that true?
That's a common belief, but it's not entirely accurate. The Sabbath was established at creation long before there were any Jews as a day of rest for all humanity. One argument is that the Sabbath was specifically given to the Israelites as a sign of their covenant with God. Exodus 31:16-17. They argue that since it was part of the Mosaic law, it was intended for the Jewish nation and not necessarily binding on Gentiles or Christians. They might also point out that the New Testament emphasizes freedom from the ceremonial laws, including strict Sabbath observance for believers in Christ.
Thank you. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely. Here's a question.
No, let me ask you a question. When you look at the Old Testament concept of Israel, one man, Abraham, was called out of Ur to go into a land, to go into Canaan. This forms the template of what an Israelite or a Jew is, the called out ones. And when you look at the Old Testament concept of the Jewish nation, you look at how people like Caleb the Kenizzite was not a Jew strictly. Rahab and Ruth, who were grafted into Old Testament Israel. If the Old Testament was a blend of people, then it's a false dichotomy to claim that Israel is strictly ethnic. Someone who is, if the original was based on not a visible cultural norms or geography for the sake of arbitrary exclusion, then it makes sense that the pattern follows. A Jew, in the strictest sense, is not one who is defined by geography or ethnicity, but one who believes in Jesus or Yahweh.
Absolutely. That's a solid point. The identity of Israel in the Old Testament was never purely ethnic or geographic. It was about being part of the covenant community and following God. People like Caleb, Rahab, and Ruth show that anyone who aligned with the faith and covenant could become part of Israel. This idea extends into the New Testament, where being part of God's people is about faith in Christ rather than ethnicity or heritage.
My question to you is, if the blueprint of the Old Testament Israel was a blend of people, if this is the pattern that Old Testament consisted of all people, not strictly ethnic or Jews, and into these were given the Sabbath, then the Sabbath is for everyone. It was never intended for a geographical people or an ethnic group. Therefore, the Sabbath is for all people.
Exactly. If the Old Testament pattern included everyone who joined in the faith, then the Sabbath, as part of God's covenant, can be seen as a gift and a rest for all people, not just a specific ethnic group. It aligns with the idea that God's principles and promises are universal. So the Sabbath can be viewed as a blessing intended for everyone who aligns with God's covenant.
So the segregation of the law, including the Sabbath, is a false dichotomy based on the false understanding of what constitutes a real Jew.
And who understanding of Israel and the covenant community shows that the Sabbath, like other aspects of God's law, isn't limited to one ethnic group, but is meant for all who choose to follow God. This understanding helps break down the barriers and shows the universal nature of God's law and promises.
Therefore, the Sabbath is for all men.
Exactly. By that reasoning, the Sabbath is indeed for all humanity, not just one group. It's a gift of rest and a sign of the relationship between God and all who follow him. The idea that the Sabbath is only for Jews and not for others is rooted in a misunderstanding of what Israel represents. The original Israel was a mixed multitude of people who joined in the covenant, not just a single ethnic group. So saying the Sabbath is only for Jews misses the broader inclusive nature of God's intentions.
Therefore, the Sabbath is for all men.
Exactly. The Sabbath is for all mankind as a universal gift of rest and connection with God, not limited to any particular group.
Thank you, ChatGPT.